Ladies, gentlemen, and lovely non-binary folk, could you please put your hands together and welcome your host for this evening, who will be no surprise to you, is me. Thank you so much. Okay, if you can't hear me all right, just yell. First and foremost, thank you so much for coming to my live-streamed midlife crisis. Okay, I'm very grateful to you for coming. Now, of course, we've had to change things around in stand-up because the big C, the Conservatives, and COVID, the Conservatives and COVID, both virulent infections of different kinds. So, the usual pattern doesn't work. You can't really go and say to anyone these days, are you well? Because nobody's really well. Who's well? Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk. They're well. Bastards, they never even responded to any of my invites. Anyway, so what we're going to do is we're going to try a slightly toned-down pandemic version of the pattern and say, give me a cheer if you're just about holding it together some of the time. Perfect, excellent, all right. Now, normally you do this sort of, so has anybody come to this gig from outside Cambridge? But that just felt a bit sad at this point. So who hasn't travelled out to Cambridge to attend this gig? You, madam, where have you not come from? You, sir, where have you not come from? Because travelling is something we used to do in the before times. It doesn't really happen anymore. Okay, so we're trying this experiment out on Zoom, and we'll see how it goes. There were a few little technical hitches, as you probably picked up. There wasn't supposed to be any, James Brown, I feel good, because I just felt like such an ironic sentiment to put in to the show, but that was just because I was having trouble juggling between the tracks. So hopefully there won't be too many other glitches, but let's see how things go. Okay, so one of the things that I'm really, really grateful to all of you for is that I've never done a stand-up show before. I've done some sets, but usually those have been sets that have been organized by other people. I've never had to do the organizing myself. And in fact, most of the time, I've tended to write my material about 2 hours before the set. I'd find a pub, get a glass of wine, and sit down and write my material, and then just go and do it. And you may find that hard to believe, but if you go and check out my material on YouTube, you'll find it a lot easier to believe. Okay, now this set has been slightly different because I actually finished writing this a whole hour ago, right? So the fact is, when I sent out that poster, I lied. I hadn't written the show. And those reviews that were in the poster, those are also lies. I just made them up. Okay, so this I've been experimenting with, and I've done it. I think, it's the first time I've done a show, and to make things easier for me, I've decided to do a show during a pandemic, with no end in sight of the pandemic, about the pandemic. So, it's pretty much planning for comedy gold. In fact, it's a bit like deciding, I'm going to be a nature documentary maker, and for my first project, I'm going to pick The Secret Life of Unicorns. And here we see the baby unicorn taking its first steps from its mother. For good evolutionary reasons, the baby unicorns are born without horns. You can probably tell I'm not very much of an impressionist. I dabble a bit in pointillism, but that's unrelated. Okay. Now, that is the joke that I am proudest of, including today. To date, 10 people have laughed at it. My pride remains unflinching. Okay, so we'll try this experiment out, see how it goes, and of course, if at any point, it gets a bit much and you want to leave, you can always just quietly slip out. Okay, so now the thing is that, we haven't even started the show yet. In fact, we're supposed to be in the preamble, but I've not even got into the preamble yet. So there's some housekeeping and stuff. So let me just get my notes. Okay. Yeah. So, a few things. So first, thank you to all of you who've got your cameras on. I'm very grateful you've got your cameras on, and feel free to have your mics unmuted. If you have children, whether they be human or animal, maybe you might want to mute them while they're around. If you've got your cameras on, that's great. I'm very mindful there are people I know from Twitter who may not want to have their cameras on. That's perfectly fine. My only condition is this: if you are planning to use this show as an alibi for a crime, then you must have your camera on, because I'm not prepared to be a witness just on the basis of your audio stream. Okay? Right, now, focus, I've got here. This is the other housekeeping bit, right? So I have a long-standing rule about my stand-up comedy, which is that I will never ask you about it. I will never ask you if you've seen my set, my show, or what you thought about it. And that holds for this as well, right? I know there are a lot of people here who I work with, and one thing that you do not have to fear is I will never come and ask you, what did you think of that show, right? In fact, the next time we meet or speak, we can both pretend that this never happened. And we may well want to, depending on how the evening pans out, okay? But I specifically say that because I'm very mindful of the members of the audience who are English, because, you find it incredibly difficult when asked direct questions to say something negative, and I don't want you to fear that at some point this will happen, you won't know what to say, and then you'll just have to move. Okay? So that isn't going to happen. Right. Now, there was the other bit of the preamble was this, actually. So, in the poster, most of it was a lie, but one thing was true, and that was that I wrote the show because it felt like not enough people were asking for my opinion about the pandemic and what I thought about what was being done. And that is true, and in fact, that's a point I made explicitly in 2 letters that I co-authored in The Lancet, and in 3 articles that I co-authored in the Byline Times. And it still somehow isn't enough. He said, his pain palpable, as he spoke into the microphone he had installed in his own house, to a group of friends who he had invited to the live streaming of his own breakdown. Anyway, okay. So, this is going to be obviously about COVID. The show will go on for about 75 minutes or so. As I kind of mentioned, timekeeping is not one of my few strengths. Oh, hang on, there's somebody trying to get in. Yeah, so timekeeping isn't one of my strengths, but it'll go on for about 75 minutes. It might suddenly stop if I sort of lose interest halfway. That may happen. My ennui's been acting up a bit of late, but hopefully we'll see our way through. Okay? And then at points it'll get a bit weird, it'll get a bit dark, inescapable that. But just to make things clear, at the end there will be a sort of Q&A in case you're wondering whether some of the stuff is real or it's just some fucked up shit that I made up, right? So I'll clarify that, and then that session will go onto the video, and it'll be called What the Fact. And after the What the Fact session, we'll break up into small discussion groups and continue afterwards. Okay? Sorry, just to reassure you, there are not going to be any small discussion groups. Now, some of you had asked me about children. Well, not generally, about children watching the show. And I mentioned to you that there is going to be a bit of swearing that you've probably gathered. I don't think it's going to be anything worse than what they'll have already encountered on the playground. But what I worry a bit more about is that there's probably going to be some dark stuff about the world, and you don't know whether you really want children to be exposed to the dark realities of what the world is actually like. But having said that, in December, my 5-year-old was discussing the following question in the playground of her primary school. Can Santa die? And she brought the question home to us, and we were not able to give her a satisfactory answer. And we're pretty convinced that she doesn't believe that Santa exists, but she's half-heartedly going on with the charade because she doesn't want to hurt our feelings. So I think children can probably handle a bit of darkness. The other point I'll make is that the show is a little bit UK-centric, and there are a few people who are calling in from other countries, so I'll provide some bit of context where required, okay? So, basically context is vital because, in case you don't get it, you just want to be sure it's not about the context, it's just that it's not funny, okay? It's horrible to have those moments of doubt. Okay, so that's the preamble out of the way. Are we ready to start? If we're ready to start, then I'm going to ask you, like we say in the operating theatre, let's make some fucking noise. Okay, thank you very much. You were very kind. Okay, so this is now where the actual show starts, right? So what happened in 2020, very early on in 2020, it became very apparent that there was a pandemic virus that was spreading across the globe like a pandemic virus. Now that was part of the problem, you see, because viruses had got so much into our language that we forgot about the reality of what they're actually like. So, when you were telling people, COVID-19 is going viral, people were asking things like, oh, you mean it's got 100 million views? I mean, no, it's got 100 million cases. Oh, you mean it's a viral sensation, sort of here today, gone tomorrow? No, it's more like your nan is here today and gone tomorrow. But the reality didn't really percolate. And I think, to an extent, that's because in the Western world, we've sort of been removed from the realities of what viruses are actually like. And was one really striking thing as somebody from India just thinking about, guys, don't you know this is what viruses are like? This is serious shit. You don't just sort of muck about and think that it sort of, it follows opening hours and only goes in particular directions when you cough, and when pubs close it decides to go home. That's not how viruses work. And that's the thing, viruses have just been removed from our proximate reality in the Western world. And they've entered essentially the realm of our fiction. They're in our TV shows, in our books, and in our movies. That's where the reality of viruses is. And in that new reality, they are watched by our health secretary, Matt Hancock, who gets his information on how to deal with the pandemic from the movies he sees. Okay? I should give you some context for non-UK people here. Matt Hancock is our health secretary, and in this desperate time, we are essentially being led in the health sector by a man who is basically Pinocchio mid-transition. Okay? He looks like a real boy, but emotionally, he's pretty much wooden. Okay? And he gets his information from his movies, and he's constantly lying, probably because he saw a certain kind of movie in which the more Pinocchio lies, the longer his penis gets. But what Matt Hancock told us this week was that he had learned that he needed to order a lot of vaccines because he had watched the movie Contagion. And in Contagion, there was a rush on vaccines. So remembering that, he bought a lot of vaccines. Now, if you haven't seen Contagion, Contagion is about a respiratory virus that moved over from bats. Sorry, somebody else is coming late. You can't even heckle. Anyway, so Contagion is about a respiratory virus that moved over to humans from bats, is spread by respiratory droplets and fomites, and to tackle it, they got on top of it very quickly, put in place very strict test, trace, and isolate, and quarantine. And all Matt Hancock took away from that movie was that he should buy a lot of vaccines. To be charitable to him, I found myself thinking, well, if he's getting his information from watching movies, maybe he would be a good person to lead us in the event of a zombie apocalypse. Right? But I have a feeling that he'd probably come up with something, sorry, just letting people in, he'd probably come up with something along the lines like, well, zombies eat brains. So if you don't have brains, you're safe. In fact, in truth, I wouldn't trust, Matt Hancock is the second last person I would trust to lead us out of a paper bag. And the only reason he's the second last person is that Chris Grayling is still alive. Now, again, context for non-UK people. Chris Grayling is one of our politicians who makes Inspector Clouseau look like James Bond. Okay? Chris Grayling awarded a multi-million contract for ferries post-Brexit to a company that had no boats. Okay? And this week, Chris Grayling was appointed as the species champion for the hedgehog. So by the end of February, the English hedgehog is going to be extinct. Okay, so these are the people, who are leading us through these difficult times. Now, I should be honest about something about my general approach here. I haven't seen the movie Contagion. Okay? In fact, I haven't seen a lot of the things that I reference both in my stand-up and actually in day-to-day life. Right? What I have in my head is a reference library of references to things. I don't actually have the things. And whenever I find that my reference library of references doesn't have enough information, I just go onto YouTube or Wikipedia and get the amount of information I need to write the set. Occasionally in conversation, this becomes very awkward and you sort of think, hang on, I've just got to check Wikipedia to make this joke. But I wrote the Wikipedia entry for Contagion this morning, and that's where I've given you all the information you've got. And even just from reading that entry, I know more than Matt Hancock does. Okay, like I said, what I'm doing is just sort of going by these kind of references that I know. And Matt Hancock, sadly, is not an aberration. I mean, he is an aberration, but he's not an aberration in our government, right? Our Prime Minister is very fond of superheroes, and here we go. And he made a couple of brilliant references, a couple of brilliant speeches early on in the pandemic. This is one from February 2020. Where he said, "We are starting to hear some bizarre autarkic rhetoric, where barriers are going up, and when there is a risk that new diseases such as coronavirus will trigger a panic and a desire for market segregation that go beyond what is medically rational to the point of doing real and unnecessary economic damage. Then at that moment, humanity needs some government somewhere that is willing to at least make the case powerfully for freedom of exchange, some country ready to take off its Clark Kent spectacles and leap into the phone booth and emerge with its cloak flowing as the supercharged champion of the right of the populations of the earth to buy and sell freely among each other." Right? Yeah, the bastard. Superman wears a cape, not a cloak. It surprises me that, occasionally politicians say something that seems sensible, that seems thoughtful and considered. And I wonder, why does that surprise anybody? Why should it surprise anyone that if you have access to a speechwriter, you occasionally say something that's sensible? I mean, the puzzle is, if you have access to a speechwriter, how do you end up saying so much shit? Here's another one. Okay, so this was in September 2019, where he brought up the matter in the Brexit negotiations of the Incredible Hulk, right? And, conversationally, that's the sort of thing that going in is going to be a tough one to rescue, even before you've started. But not one to be bothered by stuff like that. Johnson said, "Banner might be bound in manacles, but when provoked, he would explode out of them. Hulk always escaped, no matter how tightly bound. he seemed to be. And that is the case for this country. We will come out on 31st October and we will get it done. He added, the madder Hulk gets, the stronger Hulk gets. Now, that is the sort of rhetoric that is far less Hulk smash and more Hulk smashed. Now, that probably fell flat, but I should just add, because I did put some thought into it, the joke there is that because of his gamma-charged metabolism and his immunity to viruses and all sorts of toxins, the Incredible Hulk cannot get drunk. In fact, in one particular run of the series, he had business cards printed that said, "The Incredible Hulk, always smashing, never smashed." Sorry, somebody else said. Okay, so now basically the bottom line I want to emphasize is that in the midst of this disaster, we are essentially in the hands of people whose hands should never really be let out of mittens. But here we are. Okay, now one of the things that COVID-19 has emphasized for us is that we need to think about those who are less fortunate than us, right? There are lots of people who are suffering far, far more. And what I want to do is call attention to the plight of certain groups that I think have been really, really neglected, okay? And those two groups are essentially the government and the wealthy, okay? Because nobody's really thinking about how they're suffering, okay? Now the whole point is governments have been so optimized to serve the interests of the rich and career politicians. They were not expecting to have to do this job of looking after the population, right? I mean, they were just there sitting thinking, what the hell, this is the sort of shit that governments do. Why do we have to do this, right? And the wealthy were, of course, very concerned that the whole money-making machine seemed to be slowing down. And, not enough is really talked about, actually, how badly they've been affected. And so, when this first came up, there was a lot of talk from the government that, it's just like flu. You don't have to make such a big deal about it. Flu happens every year. People die every year from the flu. It's not such a big deal. In fact, if people didn't die from the flu, then that would be surprising. Because what people want is that they want stability and they want predictability. And there is nothing that is more stable and predictable than death. In fact, that is the only certainty because taxes are no longer certain. Anyway, see, just in case it's not clear, I am being deeply, deeply sarcastic there, okay? So, this show is supposed to be about the scams of COVID, and there are lots of scams, right? One of the big things that I have to struggle with is how much stuff do I put in here? There's the stuff about the PPE, there's the private contracting of test, trace and isolate, there's the awarding of multiple public contracts and loads of public money handed over to private donors and private players with no return, and then there's just screw up after screw up, right? So we had the first lockdown and then we didn't really sort that, and nothing was sorted in the first lockdown, then a second and then a third, and then we sent kids back to school for a day so that they could just go and spread the COVID that they picked up from their relatives and given their nans over Christmas to everybody else, and then they went back home so they could incubate the virus. And then sometime earlier this month, we hit 110,000 dead. Okay? So, right, now, we're seriously getting into the comedy here. Okay? This is the narrator chipping in. He's not getting into the comedy here. Right. So, those of you who know me a bit know that, I've sort of been sustained through COVID-19 essentially by my inexhaustible cynicism, Basically, I've got through this every day at a time thinking, oh, those bastards, that's just what they're fucking up to. They don't really give a shit. Yeah, you'll see the next thing they're going to do is this. And, I take no pride in the fact that I got a lot of that right, okay? But really, one of the things that bites is that when this pandemic hit us in Jan and Feb of last year, we've learned a hell of a lot about it since then. But here's the thing, we didn't need to know any of the stuff we've learned to actually deal with it, because dealing with a respiratory virus is pretty much public health 101. And there were loads of other countries that, before they even knew very much about it, did all the right stuff. Vietnam, Taiwan, Singapore, New Zealand. They locked down, they got on top of it aggressively, and they managed it, and they're fine. We never did, right? And the question that bothers me is, why didn't we? Okay? Now, for a lot of you know me, as I've said, it's one of the advantages, I guess, of, having people in the audience. And, I'm a seriously paranoid fuck. Sorry, that came out wrong. That makes it sound like I'm just kind of, very weird in bed, and nobody needs that image. I'm a seriously paranoid bastard, okay? And I will give you an example, and again, this will be a familiar one to a lot of you. I'll give you an example that will sort of demonstrate both elements of that very clearly, okay? Some years ago, when I was at work and I was trying to leave, I found that somebody had locked their bike to mine, okay? This was no accident. It was very clear. My bike was nowhere near their bike. It was not near the bike, but they locked their bike to mine, okay? And I was seriously pissed off. So I put a note. I wrote a message. It was in a bit of cash. I wrote a note and I stuck it in their brakes, and it was just so that they would see it, not like some, ill thought out sabotage attempt. I stuck a note in their brakes to tell them how pissed off I was, and then I locked my bike to their bike. And in the note I had said, call me when you get this and I'll come and unlock your bike. 6 hours later, they called me and said, you've locked your bike to mine. And I said, well, you'd locked yours to mine. And they said, no, my bike's not locked to yours, you can come and see. So I went there, and indeed, my bike was no longer locked to theirs, right? They had taken it off. And so I pulled out my phone and showed them a series of photographs I had taken from various angles of their bike locked to mine. Okay? And they said, well, in that case, it must have been so. Right? And I was seriously pissed off. But this was a consultant colleague at the hospital, so I didn't want to make a scene, okay? But I left feeling that a great injustice had been done to me. And what I did was I sat down and wrote and performed a stand-up set about that incident. And then I posted it on YouTube. Now, I don't name her in the video, but every time somebody asks me, hey, do you know anything about so-and-so from such and such department in Addenbrooke's? And I say, well, funny you should ask. I've got a video that you might find interesting to watch. Okay, so I'm hoping that that's sort of given you, some sense of, both the paranoid and the bastard bits. Okay, so one of the things that was really bothering me about this whole thing was, look, we know what to do. Why haven't we done it? Right? It's not because we don't have the information. It's not because people aren't telling the government, what needs to be done. There are loads of people sort of screaming their heads off, and they have been for months saying, look, this is what you need to do. But it still doesn't happen, right? Rishi Sunak, right, he basically argued against the first he argued in favor of the first lockdown being eased early. Then he instituted an Eat Out to Help Out scheme, which may as well been called, Get Out to Help a Virus Out, because that very clearly led to a rise in cases. He argued against a second lockdown. He actually invited Carl Hennigan and Sunitra Gupta, who were a couple of the major architects of this disastrous herd immunity policy, along with Anders Stregner, who is the architect of the disastrous Swedish herd immunity policy, to Downing Street. And that was part of this set of events that led to the second lockdown being postponed even further. And then today, not today, sorry, I think it was yesterday, he had, in the papers, he's essentially said that scientists are moving the goalposts about lockdown. And you begin to boggle and think, what do you mean scientists are moving the goalposts around lockdown? Scientists are trying very hard to keep cases down. And he's such a dick. Now, I don't know if, there are some of you who will identify with this, but as a member of an ethnic minority, right, when you see somebody who is in any way kind of connected to your community, doing something that's embarrassing or distasteful or just frankly cringeworthy, you feel a deep shame and embarrassment. And, seriously, do you know how many brown people you have let down? Right? First we have Preeti Patel, right? There's no coming back from that. Now you fucked this up, right? Pretty much all our hopes are now resting on Kamala Harris's shoulders. Okay? So anyway, I've gone down, I've sort of sidetracked down, a rather personal alleyway, shall we say. But coming back to my sort of slightly paranoid question, why exactly are we not doing anything about this? And so I began to wonder, who stands to benefit from this? Who stands to gain from our pandemic being uncontrolled? To whom might this have been initially a distraction, but now is a sort of opportunity? And, when you think about those things, it's quite obvious, because the people for whom this pandemic is a good thing are those artisan mask makers. The people who've got massive businesses on Etsy making these fancy masks. Those are the guys who've got something to gain by letting the pandemic go on. So when you think about it, Etsy and... Sorry.
Stand-up comedians.
Stand-up comedians are in a very, very dire way. They're trying to move to Zoom shows, and that's sort of working for some people. By the way, I stole all the setup from a Zoom stand-up gig of Mark Watson's that I went to a couple of weeks ago. No, so it's basically the people on Etsy, and what's essentially happening is Etsy and Pinterest have got together, and behind the scenes, it's their dark manipulations that are essentially shaping the future of our country. And there are so many questions, why? How did they do this? Why did Instagram get dropped from the deal? And in trying to understand this, you have to go back to the same old, age-old explanatory variables, which are money and power, right? So money makes sense. Okay, you're making money, you want to keep making money, and generally if you want to make lots of money, you're not really concerned about the people who are going to be screwed because you're making the money. But power is the more interesting one, and power and the way it relates to money. And this is where things are going to get, I think, even darker, right? So what I'd like to do is sort of just think back to where we were at the end of 2019. So it was where Johnson and the Conservatives had won the election. They had got Brexit done. Johnson hadn't ripped his pants turning into the Incredible Hulk or anything, but they got it done, and Brexit was definitely going to happen. In the US, the Republicans and Trump were just completely nuts, but basically both camps were doing what a lot of other populist and authoritarian movements were doing across the world, which is that they were grabbing power and consolidating in the executive and removing various checks that existed to actually control those powers. And that's essentially what's happened with Brexit. With Brexit, we've had a massive move of powers into the executive of the government, so the party in power can do, pretty much what the hell it wants, okay? And the guys who do this sort of stuff, and face it, it's overwhelmingly guys, but we should give Thatcher a mention, right? But it's overwhelmingly guys who do this stuff, are essentially doing this stuff because they have a vision of how the world should be. And most of them, are just concerned about the rough outlines. There are some people who, who get really nuts and start micromanaging that vision, like Ceausescu, and then things get really, really crazy. By the way, I don't know anything about Ceausescu. I looked him up on Wikipedia for this set. Okay. So, what's the vision here? And what I'd like to do is sort of give you some glimpses into the minds of some of the key protagonists who I think of. So, the first one is, of course, Dominic Cummings. And Dominic Cummings, I think we all know enough about because, I'm very worried that he's disappeared because I don't know where on earth he's gone. But, the information that I'm going to share with you about these key protagonists, to my mind, this is all information that's been very hard to come by, right? So, in the beginning of the pandemic, we learned that Dominic Cummings' view was, look, we'll go for herd immunity, we'll protect the economy, and, if some pensioners die, so be it. And, we would have never had access to that information had it not been leaked and published in the Times, right? So, very hard information to come by. And a lot of the rest of Dominic's thinking was really quite opaque because the only way you could access it was via his blog. So really you had no idea what the man was thinking. But what you did pick up was that he certainly had a sort of interest in eugenics, didn't really like the civil service, certainly didn't like the welfare system, and thought that the country should be a very different one from the way it was. Incidentally, Dominic's father-in-law, Humphrey Wakefield, I'm not going to use his title, is also, interestingly, a racist and a eugenicist. And again, this information is very hard to find because when you do a search and you put in Wakefield and eugenics into Google, it only really comes up as the first result. But you can hear his father-in-law talking about intelligence being in the genes and people coming, really smart people only really come from well-off families, and black people simply aren't as smart as white people. And this is all there in a video that, as I said, is very well hidden and very hard to access. Okay, right. Just give me one moment. My cat has turned up here. This is her. Now, please people, do not be manipulated, right? All of this is carefully staged, right? I arranged for the cat to come in during a lull in the show, so you would all go, aww, right? Now, if it was a dog, I could have really planned this out. Because it was a cat, it's very difficult. So that's why I deliberately had so many lulls in the show. Okay? So whenever the cat comes in, hey, presto. Anyway, okay. So, right, so that's Wakefield. Now, the next person is Stanley Johnson, who's Boris's dad. Right, and Boris's dad has been unusually prominent for the dad of a prime minister. I mean, we don't tend to see very much of the prime minister's dad on the media or anywhere else. I mean, David Cameron, I presume, does have a dad, basic biology, but, we never saw anything of him. But Stanley Johnson, is unusually prominent, and in this very obscure, little-known interview that he did with The Guardian, which is available after some searching on YouTube, Stanley Johnson talks about his views about population control and how it's important to control the population because that's the only way that economic growth will be able to sustain the human population. And in his view, England, the UK, should have 10 to 15 million people, okay? Max 25 to 30, right? And he was very concerned in this video because he talked about, you see, the black, the brown, and the yellow races, they reproduce a lot more than the white races do. So, we've got to seriously think about that. And so concerned was Stanley Johnson about population control that he only had 6 children. And his son also clearly took this advice on board and the strategy on board, and what he decided was that, children I don't know about don't exist. So, that's what Stanley Johnson thinks, and again, we have very little insight into Boris Johnson's mind because I mean, all we have to go on are the hundreds of articles that he's written in various media outlets over the course of his career. So, I mean, we really don't know what he thinks, but when you read the articles, you get a definite, a very strong hint of racism and white exceptionalism and sometimes white supremacy. But, okay, that's him. The next person I want to bring up is Jacob Rees-Mogg. And now, Jacob Rees-Mogg, I think, is a particularly dangerous character. And interestingly, a big part of the story is Jacob Rees-Mogg's dad, right? Now, again, we know very little about Jacob Rees-Mogg's dad and what he thought, because he only wrote 3 books about what he thought about the world. Right. And in 1997, with Dale Davidson, he wrote a book called The Sovereign Individual. Right? Again, I haven't read The Sovereign Individual, I've just read the Wikipedia entry. But in The Sovereign Individual, by the way, Jacob Rees-Mogg's dad is a dick, because on the cover of this book, his name is down as Lord William Rees-Mogg. Right? And who the fuck puts Lord on the book cover? Anyway, so in this book, he talks about the sovereign individual. And basically what he means by the sovereign individual is the wealthy. He's very, very anti the welfare state. He's very anti-democracy and any kind of equality politics. As far as he's concerned, what the world really needs is to allow the sovereign individual to make money unfettered by interference from government of any kind. Right? He spoke very warmly of the coming cyber age because he believed that, if you could set up business in cyberspace, there would be no government. You would not be taxed, because tax, to his mind, and he said so very explicitly, is essentially a punishment of the rich. Okay? So the world that he dreamt of was one in which none of this existed, where the sovereign individual would be allowed to flourish unfettered by government, rules, rights, and equalities of any kind. And he did admit in the book that there would be some left behind, but that's okay, that's sort of the price to pay. Now, I don't know exactly what Jacob Rees-Mogg thinks. Again, like I said, we've only got the media interviews and his voting record to go on. But when I think of both Boris and Jacob Rees-Mogg, you do kind of think, the apples can't have fallen all that far from the tree, right? Even if the apples are only falling upwards. So, one of the things that, Jacob Rees-Mogg had said after the Brexit referendum was that, look, we're probably not going to see the benefits of Brexit for at least 50 years, right? Which was, horrific, because most of us are going to be dead in 50 years. It's only going to be him and the rest of the undead who will still be around to see it, right? But that's basically what he got us into. And, a little while ago, I don't know if you saw this, Jacob Rees-Mogg was asked in Parliament about what they were going to do about the impact of Brexit on fishermen. And his response was, well, the fish are now British fish, and they're all the happier for it. Right? And now, that's the kind of thing that I have to admit, it gladdens my heart. Because, any of you who are pet owners will know, the sight of a happy fish is something just to behold. It's just lovely. The way they run around when the doorbell rings and they jump on you and they lick you and they, want to play fetch. No, hang on, that's dogs. No, the way that they sort of climb onto your lap and then, they rub themselves against your legs and, they want to be pet. No, that's cats, isn't it? That's cats. No, so happy fish, yeah, I remember now. Happy fish, it's lovely to see happy fish. The way they look at you and they go... it's a heartwarming sight because it breaks your heart when you see them sad. They just look at you and they go... So, I'm really glad that the fish are happy. But my point is this, Jacob, you were negotiating on behalf of the fishermen, not the fish. So, that is, anyway. So, That's the man that he is, right? And sometimes I do wonder whether Jacob Rees-Mogg does feel some disdain for Boris, because he sort of thinks, well, the silly cove actually wants the oiks to like him. Who on earth would want that? Okay, now, just to be clear, these are, I think, the more prominent people involved, but they're not the only people involved, right? Because there are lots of other groups that have all sort of come in line with this sort of vision. So, I have this thing, so conspiracy theory groups, right? So this is the list I've got. So conspiracy theory groups, they're COVID skeptics, they're COVID deniers, there are various lobby groups that are representing ordinary people, like Us for Them. Us for Them is a group of parents who are campaigning for schools to open, right? Now, no group of parents has access to a PR company. Right? If you've got a glossy website and you've got a spokesperson and you've got reach in government, you're not a grassroots association. So there's a lot of dark money that's sort of going in funding these groups, right? And another tragedy has been that we've had a lot of scientists who are actually part of the herd immunity, the anti-vax, and all the other nonsense. So basically, my idea, or my answer to the question is essentially, I think the reason we're in this mess is because we're in the hands of a group of people whose worldview is, don't stop the world to save people. It's okay if people die, and overall it might not be such a bad thing. Essentially, they're the kind of people who say to you, we want a small government. And all they want you to say back is, would you like fries with that? Okay, by the way, now I know that to some of you, this is going to sound like a conspiracy theory. And I just want to tell you, that is what they want you to think. Okay, but conspiracy theories are a big part of the whole sort of right-wing movement, right? But what conspiracy theories are essentially ideas that sort of infect minds, and then they go searching for evidence. They say, aha, he raised his eyebrow in that photograph. Oh yes, and on the dark web, on this message board, there was a message that said, the future is bright, the future is orange. That means Trump is the Messiah. Right? Now, you may laugh, but that's basically the kind of shit that QAnon was all about, right? But what's interesting about conspiracy theories is not the actual theory, but the breadth of it, right? So, I've got a transcript here from an interview done by Hardeep Mathur from the Byline Times with Kate Shamarani, who is one of the UK's most prominent conspiracy theorists. And she's pretty much, any conspiracy, she's on it, right? What I'm going to do is I'm going to read a transcript of this interview out, and I'm going to comment along the way. You'll have a pretty clear idea which bit is me and which bit is her. And she says, I am English. I was born in England. I will say this. I have black friends. And again, you'd want to, do they know they are friends? I have black friends, but when I see the police taking one knee at a Black Lives Matter rally, I am disgusted. That is what I'm about. So whatever group has come together, whatever synergy you talk about, we have an overlap of core values. Even if you look at the WHO, who are run by Tedros the terrorist, he's not even a doctor of medicine. So now when I liken this to Auschwitz and the cattle trunk, you tell me the difference, because the only time in history I can find where the nurses and doctors were allowed to end people's lives was the nurses of the Third Reich, when they took the disabled, the elderly, the epileptics, the children that were disabled. They took them into these places, they took away their food and water, they gave them cocktails of drugs to kill them. That is verbatim. I haven't spliced stuff together, to make it sound even weirder. It is just that bad shit. Okay. And at this point, you've sort of interrupted and said, you know what? You comparing what's happening with COVID-19 to Auschwitz, people might find that a bit offensive. So where's your proof about this? To which he said, I don't care if they find it offensive. I find it offensive that our elderly are being murdered in care homes. Stop being a special snowflake and saying you're offended. They're killing our elderly, our most vulnerable. Now, going back to Black Lives Matter, I mean, it's something that she seems to have a little bit of a focus on. The leading cause of death among black African Americans is abortions. Right? Now, that's an idea that's very hard to get your head around, right? But when you think about it, when you've looked at any major act of violence against black people in the United States, at the same time, there have also been abortions. Not in the same place, but somewhere in the country. And are you telling me that's coincidence? Yeah, it is. It's fucking coincidence. Anyway, yeah, so black people are killed by abortions, funded by the government, started as Planned Parenthood, and then, as I said, this is no different to the death camps, and I call the ambulances or the cattle trucks when I have testimonies from relatives and healthcare professionals that people are being taken into hospitals and murdered using midazolam and morphine. What else do we call it? I call it genocide, right? Oh, and by the way, going back to the Jewish thing, somebody called me anti-Semitic. It's ridiculous because I said George Soros has funded Black Lives Matter, which is well known and well documented. I'm not anti-Jewish, I have Jewish friends. And again, I don't know if they know that they're her friends. Okay, but that is completely bad shit, but the reason I sort of wanted to go through that, you can just see how all these conspiracy theories have essentially taken hold of every bit of crap out there and put them together. But it's not the weird stuff that they think and say. This is something that she said after an interview at a scandemic rally. These are the people who are essentially protesting, say that COVID-19 doesn't exist, all the stuff about us having to wear a mask and the deprivation of our liberties. It's all nonsense, none of this is really happening. Presumably they're just taking elderly people into care homes and murdering them for some other reason, pretending there's a virus. Anyway, but what's worrying is that she's funded by the same sort of right-wing groups that fund Us for Them and the Great Barrington Declaration, which was this massive propaganda machine for herd immunity. Now, what's happened over here is that I've messed up my notes, and for all you know, the show's actually over, and I'm just keeping you guys here because I don't know what comes next. Okay. Anyway, so one of the things about the pandemic is that, sadly, it's brought into stark relief the problems of our existing power structures and the world that it's created, right? It's laid bare the corrosive aspects of the patriarchy of white exceptionalism and white supremacy. But the one thing that has sort of shone through, I think, has really been women leaders and women scientists, because what they've done is been amazing. Right? So my wife, Dr. Deepthi Gurdasani, who some of you know personally, some of you will know through Twitter, some of you will have seen her on the TV or the radio, because Deepthi's been just tirelessly talking to the media, trying to get the government to take the pandemic seriously. And some days she's been on 10 different outlets trying to make these points. And one thing that she keeps getting told is, the stuff you're saying, it's kind of depressing. And you think, it's a fucking pandemic. It's a pandemic and people are dying. How is this still going to be depressing? Don't you have something positive to say? A positive note you can end on? And the 2 points there, one bit is obviously the misogyny, right? You're a woman, you're supposed to be making us feel better, right? We shouldn't be feeling bad, End on a positive note, or to be precise, our capitalist masters would like you to end on a positive note, so people take this seriously, but not too seriously, right? Now, it reminds me of, when I occasionally do talks at well-being workshops, right, people ask me for tips, if you could give us one tip for improving our well-being, what would that be? And I sort of think, what the shit? There's no one tip for improving our well-being. And you know what the strongest evidence of that is? Those weird banner ads you see for one weird tip to lose belly fat, or one weird tip to deal with wrinkles that dermatologists don't want you to know? Even those guys don't do one weird tip to improve your well-being, right? Even they know, look, nobody's going to buy that. Just put on another round of penis enlargement pills. Okay, so there is no one tip to improve your well-being. But I get where people are coming from, right? I know, I can sense their pain. I know why they're desperate. So sometimes what I'll do is I'll put on my gravest, kindest psychiatrist voice and say, if there is one thing that you can do to improve your well-being, it is to accept that there are no simple, straightforward solutions for complex multifactorial problems. And they're rarely comforted by it. So sometimes I try something else and I say, the one thing that I suggest is, try and be kinder to yourself, right? Self-compassion can be really helpful, but it can be a really hard thing to do. So what I always tell people is what my first psychiatry professor told me, which is try and be compassionate to previous versions of yourself that went through those difficult periods. And then you can work your way up to maybe being compassionate to your current self. Now, frankly, I think the no simple solutions to complex multifactorial problems is a lot more useful. But it doesn't go down as well. The second one, I think, has just got this slightly warmer glow, and it has this sense that, I'm passing on wisdom that has come to me from the generation above, and it must mean something. Now, all this stuff isn't entirely irrelevant, right? Because what I've done over the course of this is I've walked you through some pretty dark shit, right? It's meant to be a comedy show, which you've all very kindly indulged, while I've talked to you about how the elite are trying to basically shape the world in their image. And that's a very positive note to sort of end on. I basically said, look, what the government's decided is that, look, the way it's going to be is that a lot of us are going to have to lose a leg, right? That can't be helped. But a lot of us are going to have to lose a leg. But, the thing is that what we ought to do is look after the people who really need two legs. And the rest of us will go out and maybe we'll lose a little bit of a leg. But, young people, they get along fairly well with 1 point something legs. So what we'll do is we'll just wait it out, and then this leg virus will go away, and we'll be all right. There'll be some people who'll still have two legs, but if they don't have two legs, well, that's fine. And we're left to deal with this and figure out how do we sort of find our way through. So we have discussions about, should schools open or should schools close, which are essentially feel like, so should children lose their right leg or their left leg? I mean, if they lose their right leg, we'll have a lot fewer footballers, so there won't be anybody to save the next generation of children from starvation. So maybe left leg? Anyway, so it's all, pretty weird, messed up stuff. So you may rightfully ask me, look, what do I have to offer having done this, right? I mean, have I given you anything more than a sort of more informed and nuanced mistrust of your government? And to which I'd say, yeah, fair point. I can't tell you what to do. I don't have one weird tip for dealing with pandemic stress. But what I would say is, if you take just one thing away from this show, right? You clearly haven't been paying attention. Now, that is not my joke. That is Simon Munnery's joke. I really love it and I fit it in wherever I can, in talks, in seminars, at the end of therapy sessions. But I always credit him. Okay? And the truth is, I can't tell you what to do. I can't tell you how we deal with this. All I can do is tell you what I would do. And what I would do is I would sit down and write a stand-up show and perform it and put it on YouTube. And then when people come and ask me, hey, what do you think about so-and-so and such, I'd say to them, well, funny you should ask that. I've got a video on YouTube that you might find interesting. Thank you all very much. I am very, very grateful for your indulgence. That's the actual end of the show. Thank you. I will now put the mic away. I think